Ambassador laments that a dozen of Russian spies won't be able anymore to enjoy all the benefits of American life while doing things incompatible with their status used as a cover-up. The Russian ambassador should instead work hard to report to his superiors that only his cronies, a bunch of cronies, buy his narrative here in the United Nations. I want to conclude with saying that I'm looking forward to midnight, even though the midnight is the most dangerous time right now because that's when most of the attacks take place. But I'm looking forward to midnight when this abomination, occupation of the seat of the President of the Council, will be over. I thank you.
I would like to now give the floor to Martin Griffiths and Filippo Grandi and ask them to answer the question that we put when we made the statement about the placement of heavy weaponry in residential areas in Ukrainian towns, and how is this in line with international humanitarian law? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Let me respond to that, if I may. I'll try to. I can say that we have no confirmation of such reports of radicals placing such weaponry in residential areas. The fact is that accountability at this stage for breaches of international humanitarian law, which we must see in time, is naturally at this level of the conflict and this level of the violence, at this level of the uncertainty, very difficult to establish. We are truly in a period of a fog of war, a fog which obscures the futures of so many people of Ukraine. I made a number of points, I would add, in my remarks, in my briefing, about our fears of the impact on civilian objects, civilian infrastructure, as a result of urban warfare. I mentioned, for example, Mr. President, our reminder that large-scale urban warfare also requires the need to avoid the wide-area explosive weapons. We are very, very concerned at what we're seeing now in the streets of some of the key large modern cities of Ukraine. People are voting with their feet, the way in which basic services are being interrupted, and the way in which civilian infrastructure is being damaged. And we will, in time, I am quite sure, discover who did what and who broke which requirements of international humanitarian law. Thank you very much.
Thank you. No, I wanted to ask Filippo Grandi, do you want to take the floor?
No, thank you, Mr. President. I fully support what the Undersecretary General just said. Thank you.
There are no more names described on the list of speakers, but before adjourning the meeting, I would like to say that whilst listen to our briefers, I was surprised because just the reports and videos and information in Ukraine, some of them are taken as fact, and others, which are obvious, the ones that we have in the internet are fully reliable, unquestionably reliable, are being considered inaccurate, unreliable, are considered So the last scheduled meeting of the Council for the month several important issues within our purview, although, as you know, not on everyone. I would like to once again thank all the representatives of the Secretariat, including the conference services, interpreters and translators, verbatim reporters, and security staff. Our presidency is coming to an end, and I know I speak on behalf of the Council in wishing the delegation of the United Arab Emirates good luck in the month of March. The meeting is adjourned.
Уважаемые коллеги,
Distinguished colleagues, before we start our meeting today, I would like to inform you about yet another hostile step undertaken by the host country. It's a step against the Russian mission. Just now, literally an hour ago, we were informed that from the Russian mission, 12 of its staff are being expelled. This is yet another gross violation by the host country of the UN agreement with the host country, of the Vienna Convention, and etc., etc. We have been saying for a long time that we need to start an arbitration procedure on the implementation by the host country of its obligations to maintain normally functioning missions and permanent representations to the UN. Unfortunately, this arbitration to date has not been begun. We keep being told about the need for diplomacy, diplomatic solutions, and at the same time, our opportunities to conduct this kind of activity are being restricted. We deeply regret this decision, and we'll see how events develop within the context of this decision. We now have an unofficial meeting now, but I can see that the U.S. representative has asked for the floor.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to take a quick minute. The status of the 12 diplomats you refer to, I don't think is really the proper subject for this meeting, especially given the gravity of what we're here to discuss, which is untold humanitarian suffering in the country of Ukraine. But since you have raised the issue, I will just ensure my colleagues that the step that the United States government informed the Russian mission of today was taken in full accordance with the headquarters agreement that we signed with the UN, and that those diplomats that have been asked to leave the United States were engaged in activities that were not in accordance with their responsibilities and obligations as diplomats. So under Section 13B of the headquarters agreement, they have been given a request to depart this country so they do not harm the national security of the host country. And I look forward to taking the issue up, Mr. President, where it properly belongs, which is the host country committee. Thank you very much.
Indeed, our meeting is not on this, but we do have our own opinion on this, and the explanations which I heard from the representative of the United States are not satisfactory to us. The 8,983rd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is letter dated 28th February 2014 from the permanent representative of Ukraine to the United Nations, addressed to the President of the Security Council, S/2014/136. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in the meeting: Mr. Martin Griffiths, Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, and Mr. Filippo Grandi, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. And I now give the floor to Mr. Martin Griffiths.
Mr. President, I speak to you from Geneva, and wherever you are in the world, we've all been watching the military offensive in Ukraine with a sense of disbelief and horror. As we all feared, civilians are already paying the price. The scale of civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure, even in these very early days, is alarming. Humanitarian needs are growing at an alarming pace. in the hardest hit areas. Civilian children, women, and men have been injured and killed. Homes have been damaged and sometimes destroyed. As of yesterday, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights reported at least 406 civilian casualties, including at least 102 dead in these few days. The real figure could be considerably higher, as many reported casualties have yet to be confirmed. We know, and we will hear, of course, much more from Filippo, that at least 160,000 people have been internally displaced across Ukraine, fleeing for safety. We know that figure is likely to be much higher, potentially a significant proportion of the entire population. And of course, as Filippo will tell you, we believe more than 500,000 refugees have been forced to choose to flee their country in search of safety. So families are separated. The elderly and people with disabilities find themselves trapped and unable to flee, not even able to get that small comfort. The picture is grim and could get worse still. Aerial attacks and fighting in urban areas are damaging critical civilian facilities and disrupting essential services such as health, electricity, water and sanitation, which effectively leaves civilians without the basics for day-to-day life. Bridges and roads have been destroyed, cutting off people's access to critical supplies and services. The use of explosive weapons in urban areas carries a high risk of indiscriminate impact. This is of particular concern in places like Kiev and Kharkiv. Civilians will undeservedly suffer the most from these attacks on densely populated urban centers. It follows. All parties must respect international humanitarian law, take constant care to spare all civilians and civilian objects from harm throughout their military operations. A party should also, of course, avoid the use of wide area explosive weapons in populated areas. And the longer this goes on, the greater the cost will be for civilians. Children will miss school and face a greater risk of physical harm, displacement, and unimaginably severe emotional stress. Women, so often disproportionately affected by conflict, as we have so often discussed in this chamber, will be at even greater risk of gender-based violence, and women and children may be exposed to other forms of exploitation. The economy of Ukraine could implode, which will further exacerbate humanitarian needs and create a ripple effect that travels far beyond Ukraine's borders. Already the upheavals in recent days are deepening a pre-existing humanitarian crisis. 8 grueling years of conflict in eastern Ukraine had already left 3 million people in need of humanitarian assistance on both sides of the contact line in the Donbass region. And it goes without saying that humanitarian needs are now much greater, including the large-scale displacement to which I've already referred, across and beyond the entire country and not only in one region thereof. Humanitarian workers are doing their best to respond. The UN has expanded its humanitarian presence in Ukraine. We shall continue to do so. We're working to ensure we can scale up our operations as quickly as possible, and we had been preparing for this for some time. I must say that for the last 3 days, however, our movements, the movements of our dear colleagues in Ukraine, have been seriously constrained as a result of ongoing fighting and our inability to receive assurances from the parties to the conflict that humanitarian movements will be protected. And only this evening, I was fortunate to receive the beginning of some assurances to that effect. We must hope that comes into reality. In the meantime, local organizations and institutions are doing, as usual, the truly remarkable job that they do in all such situations, responding to needs. Local NGOs and the Ukrainian Red Cross, are working tirelessly to support civilians and evacuation operations. Health workers working day and night to care for the injured. Aid organizations providing psychosocial support to traumatized children, delivering first aid kits. And we're all here this evening, this afternoon, to support their efforts. Today, our most pressing humanitarian needs are for emergency medical services, including sexual and reproductive health services, critical medicine, health supplies and equipment, safe water for drinking and hygiene, shelter and protection for the displaced. In all, 119 organizations, partners, humanitarian organizations, are operating in Ukraine, able to provide some form of humanitarian assistance, though clearly stilted in these particular days. Right now, we urgently need progress on two fronts if we want to reach more people with aid that they need, that they deserve. First, we need the assurances from parties to the conflict that humanitarian workers and movements will be protected even during the most severe days of the conflict and not waiting for the conflict to subside. Even now, even today, even yesterday, we need to provide those protections to those workers to do the job that they want to do. Under international humanitarian law, all parties must allow and facilitate rapid and unimpeded passage of impartial humanitarian relief for civilians in need, and must ensure the freedom of movement of humanitarians, a point we have been making in many different ways in these past 4 days. Secondly, of course, we desperately need more resources. Tomorrow, the Secretary General will launch a humanitarian appeal for this crisis with two components: a 3-month flash appeal for the situation inside the country and a regional response plan for the situation outside under the leadership of Filippo Grandi and his office. The Secretary General, alongside Filippo, our NGO colleagues, and I, will all call on member states to show support with quick, generous, and flexible funding. And cash will be a major source of delivery of humanitarian assistance in the particular circumstances that obtain in Ukraine. But this is certainly not enough. The lives of millions of civilians are simply at stake. We know from other recent conflicts how brutal, deadly, and protracted urban warfare can be. We know how countries' economies can be devastated, infrastructure, investment, and development gains set back an entire generation. And we know enough to know that we do not yet know what it will be the consequences of the events that we observe today. These things should never happen in any country, anywhere. Every effort, of course, must be made to de-escalate the conflict. The hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who have taken the decision to leave their homes to seek safety elsewhere in their country or beyond, and those, even more of them, who remain at peril for the loss of basic services, of pensions, of support, of the services their children need, of the safety of a day that may come and may not. I reiterate finally, Mr. President, the Secretary General's call for the only thing that we must all pray for, an immediate cessation of hostilities. Mr. President, thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Griffiths for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Filippo Grandi.
Mr. President, greetings from Geneva. Today and in recent days, you have heard that the United Nations humanitarian organizations, together with their NGO partners, have remained in Ukraine. Let me start by saying how proud I am that we decided to do so, just like we did in Afghanistan a few months ago. But naturally, as we just heard, our colleagues on the ground, like the rest of the civilian population, are now caught up in this deadly conflict. Many of them were relocated, and military attacks might force them to move again. Yet, they're still striving to deliver help to people in need whenever a small window of relative security allows for humanitarian aid to be distributed, working with partners, including especially national NGOs, often in extremely dangerous circumstances. But we know that we're not even scratching the surface to meet the needs of Ukrainians, including an unknown but surely very substantial number who have been forced to flee their homes over the past days. The situation is moving so quickly, and the levels of risk are so high by now that it is impossible for humanitarians to distribute systematically the help that Ukrainians desperately need. I therefore echo as well the urgent call made by the Secretary General and just a few minutes ago by the Emergency Relief Coordinator and by others indeed. Civilians and civilian infrastructure must be protected and spared, and humanitarian access must be granted for those delivering aid to those impacted by war. A failure to do so will compound the already extraordinary levels of human suffering. Mr. President, in addition to the grave situation inside Ukraine, and as Martin just told us, hundreds of thousands are seeking refuge in neighboring countries. They need safety and protection, first and foremost, but also shelter, food, hygiene, and other support, and they need it urgently. As we speak, there are 520,000 refugees from Ukraine in neighboring countries. This figure has been rising exponentially, hour after hour, literally, since Thursday. I have worked in refugee crisis for almost 40 years, and I have rarely seen such an incredibly fast rising exodus of people. The largest, surely, within Europe since the Balkan Wars. Over 280,000 have fled to Poland. Another 94,000 to Hungary. Nearly 40,000 are currently in Moldova, 34,000 in Romania, 30,000 in Slovakia, tens of thousands in other European countries. We're also aware that a sizable number have gone to the Russian Federation. I want to commend the governments of receiving countries for allowing refugees access to their territory. The challenge to admit and register, to meet the needs and ensure the protection of those fleeing are daunting. But so far they have been met, though I am seriously concerned about the likely and further escalation in the number of arrivals. Mr. President, we may have just seen the beginning. So my message today is one of gratitude to the governments of Ukraine's neighbors, and also through them, my heartfelt thanks to the citizens of those countries, ordinary Poles, Hungarians, Moldovans, Romanians, Slovaks, and citizens of other European countries have undertaken extraordinary acts of humanity and kindness. This is the humanitarian instinct that is so needed in times of crisis. I encourage governments to continue to maintain access to territory for all those fleeing. Ukrainians, of course, but also third country nationals living in Ukraine, people there to work and to study, and in some cases, people that are in Ukraine as refugees, and all of whom are now similarly forced to escape the violence. At this critical juncture, there can be no discrimination against any person or any group. I'm aware that the European Union, its member states, and other governments have already provided countries receiving refugees from Ukraine with bilateral support, which I hope will continue. UNHCR, with its United Nations partner agencies and national and international NGOs, is present in all these countries, and we are scaling up. We encourage host countries to avail themselves of our support and expert advice as they address the situation and uphold their international obligations. We're helping and can do more in areas like protection and registration, organizing reception capacity, providing emergency relief and cash assistance, and in identifying and responding to the needs of the most vulnerable, many of them women and children, including a growing number of unaccompanied and separated children. Mr. President, I regret to say that unless there is, as Martin said, an immediate halt to conflict, Ukrainians will simply continue to flee. We're currently planning, I repeat, planning, for up to 4 million refugees in the coming days and weeks. Such a rapid increase would be a huge burden for receiving states and would no doubt stress reception systems and related resources. Like all countries hosting refugees around the world, they cannot be left alone to shoulder this responsibility. I therefore welcome the support expressed by many European states at yesterday's European Union Justice and Home Affairs Council to activate the Temporary Protection Directive for people fleeing Ukraine. This would enable, if activated, immediate and temporary refuge in the European Union. It would also facilitate the sharing of responsibility for people fleeing Ukraine among European states. As Martin mentioned, we will launch the UN Humanitarian Appeal for Ukraine tomorrow for activities both inside and outside the country. Private citizens and companies from around the world have already offered extraordinary financial support through thousands of donations, over $40 million to UNHCR alone in a couple of days. And I'm counting on governments to do the same, and quickly. Ukrainians and countries hosting refugees from Ukraine cannot wait. Finally, Mr. President, a reminder that Ukrainian refugees, like all others, and please let us not forget the continuing plight of Afghans, of Syrians, of Ethiopians, of the Rohingya people from Myanmar, and of many others. All of them never wanted to be refugees. They never wanted to be forced to flee their homes, and they all hope to return to their country as quickly as possible. Mr. President, members of the Security Council, it is not very often that I get to brief the Security Council. Let me take this opportunity, therefore, to echo what I said to the Council the last time you invited me a few months ago, that humanitarian workers are courageous, resourceful, and experienced. But they cannot keep the pace of conflicts constantly growing in numbers and gravity around the world. I speak to you as a sixth night of anguish falls over Europe, struck once again by war, and as millions of innocent Ukrainian civilians huddle in bunkers, scramble to board overcrowded trains, and think with trepidation about the future of their children. Let me say,
Bonjour tout le
as
monde,
an
est-ce que
old
vous pouvez m'entendre?
humanitarian worker myself,
Oui,
Oui,
bonjour.
bonjour.
that the responsibility that you have to ensure that eventually peace and security for all prevail over power struggles and narrow national interest has never been as urgent and as indispensable a task as it is tonight. If you fail,
Est-ce que tout le monde peut voir mon écran?
it might be too late for us all.
Oui.
Thank you.
Thank
Parfait.
Mr. Brander for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members.
D'accord,
who
donc
wish to
aujourd'hui,
make
on va
statements.
commencer notre deuxième partie,
I give the floor to the
Euh,
representative of France.
la partie qui va